2 hours. That's all the time that was left before the world potentially changed forever. 2 hours before a deadline that had military commanders on edge, oil markets in free fall, and millions of people holding their breath. And then, out of nowhere, everything stopped. Iran's supreme leader issued a direct order to every single military unit under his command: ceasefire immediately. So what just happened? And why does one expert already calling this a humiliating defeat for the United States? Stay with me, because this story is moving fast and the details are shocking. Let's rewind just a little bit, because to understand how big this moment is, you need to understand what we were looking at just hours ago. President Donald Trump had set a hard deadline. He had been threatening to resume bombing Iran, and not just military targets. Trump had publicly talked about destroying Iranian infrastructure, roads, bridges, civilization itself, in his words.
And the clock was ticking. And the clock was ticking. Markets were panicking. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical waterways on the planet, responsible for moving roughly 20% of the world's oil, was effectively closed. Every hour it stayed shut, the global economy bled a little more. And then, with exactly 2 hours left on that deadline, Donald Trump announced a ceasefire. Here's exactly what went down. Trump announced that the United States was suspending its bombing campaign against Iran for 2 weeks. The condition attached to that pause: Iran had to completely reopen the Strait of Hormuz to free trade and transit. Within minutes of Trump's statement, Iran's foreign minister came forward and confirmed it. Iran would halt all attacks on the condition that attacks against Iran also stopped. He went further. He said that safe transit through the Strait of Hormuz would be guaranteed for the next 2 weeks, coordinated directly with Iranian forces. And then came the statement that sealed it. Iran's supreme leader, by speaking through a readout on Iran's state-run news channel, instructed every military branch under his command to stop firing. The exact words of that statement: "This is not the end of the war, but all military branches should follow the supreme leader's order and cease their fire." Read that again. This is not the end of the war. That single line tells you everything about the tension that still exists underneath this ceasefire. Nobody is celebrating a resolution. What both sides have agreed to is a pause, a window, and what happens inside that window could define the next decade of global geopolitics. As that statement was still reverberating, 2 more pieces fell into place. The White House confirmed that Israel had also agreed to the Iran ceasefire. That is significant because Israel had been actively bombing Iranian infrastructure throughout the day, just hours before the ceasefire, bragging publicly about destroying bridges and roads inside Iran. And Iraq stepped forward with its own statement, welcoming the U.S.-Iran ceasefire and calling for what it described as sustainable dialogue going forward. In less than 3 hours, the entire landscape of the Middle East conflict had shifted. Now, here's a piece of this story that most people are missing. This ceasefire did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because of back-channel talks that had been running quietly in the background. And the country that brokered it, the country that made the phone calls, held the conversations, and built the bridge between Washington and Tehran is Pakistan. Starting this Friday, formal talks will begin. Pakistan will serve as the official mediator between the United States and Iran. These are not informal conversations. These are not informal conversations. These are structured negotiations aimed at something bigger, what Trump himself described as a possible permanent resolution. Let that sink in. A few days ago, Trump was talking about destroying Iranian civilization. Today, he is using the words permanent resolution. Something changed, and we need to talk about what that something was. We spoke to Peter Kuznick, professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University in Washington, D.C., and his assessment was blunt. He called it a stunning and positive development and said the world could breathe a collective sigh of relief. But then he said something that will make a lot of people uncomfortable. He said that as far as he can tell, the United States has not achieved any of its objectives. Iran's 10-point peace proposal is now being accepted by Trump as a viable starting point for negotiations. It covers the Palestinian people in Gaza, That proposal, he pointed out, extends well beyond Iran. It covers the Palestinian people in Gaza. It addresses Hezbollah in Lebanon. It essentially requires the United States and Israel to stand down on multiple fronts simultaneously. His words were direct. This looks like a one-sided victory for Iran and a humiliating defeat for the United States and a significant defeat for Israel as well. Now, these are strong words, but consider what Trump had publicly stated as his objectives going into this conflict. The goals shifted constantly. At various points, the stated aims included stopping Iran's nuclear program, regime change in Tehran, and total Iranian military submission. None of those outcomes have materialized. What has materialized is a ceasefire built on Iran's own framework. There is another dimension to this story that cannot be ignored. He threatened to target what he called civilizational sites. And on one occasion, in a public post, he ordered Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz and used language that, in any diplomatic context, would be considered extraordinary. When we asked Professor Kuznick directly whether these threats and Israel's actual strikes on Iranian civilian infrastructure would constitute war crimes, he did not hesitate. He said yes. Unmistakably and absolutely. Targeting civilian infrastructure, roads, bridges, civilian utilities is a war crime under international law, regardless of who carries it out. He expressed hope that accountability would follow so that the precedent is set that these actions cannot be taken with impunity. He also raised a question that, frankly, has been haunting analysts for days. Trump had spoken about destroying Iranian civilization in a matter of hours. Professor Kuznick asked aloud, how do you destroy the civilization of a nation of 90 million people in 4 hours without using nuclear weapons? Trump had spoken about destroying Iranian civilization in a matter of hours. Professor Kuznick asked aloud, how do you destroy the civilization of a nation of 90 million people in 4 hours without using nuclear weapons? That question is why people were terrified. Not just analysts, not just diplomats, people. So what finally moved Trump toward this ceasefire? According to Professor Kuznick, the answer is domestic pressure inside the United States itself. Trump's Republican base, which has been described for years as ironclad and unshakable, began showing fractures. Democrats, who had been criticized for months for lacking backbone on foreign policy, began speaking out more forcefully. There were public conversations about the 25th Amendment. There were reports of discussions within the U.S. military about how to respond to orders that some commanders considered illegal and immoral. Oil prices were spiking. Supply chains were being disrupted. The message being sent from multiple directions inside the United States was clear. This cannot continue. And economically, the pressure was enormous. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz was not just an inconvenience. It was a stress test on the entire global economy. Oil prices were spiking. Supply chains were being disrupted. The risk of a global recession, or worse, a global depression, was being discussed in serious terms by serious economists. The world could not sustain this. And apparently, that reality reached the Oval Office. So where does this go from here? The next 2 weeks are a window. Iran has agreed to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. The U.S. has suspended its bombing campaign. Pakistan is preparing to host negotiations starting Friday. But the Supreme Leader's statement made one thing very clear. This is not the end of the war. Both sides have simply agreed to pause, reassess, and talk. Whether those talks produce anything durable depends on a dozen variables, including whether Trump stays committed to the process, whether Israel accepts any framework that includes Gaza and Lebanon, and whether Iran's terms can be met without either side losing face domestically. What is certain is this: the Strait of Hormuz is open. Oil is moving again. And for the first time in weeks, the threat of a catastrophic escalation has stepped back from the edge. 2 hours before a deadline that could have changed the world, a ceasefire was announced. Iran's supreme leader ordered his forces to stand down. The Strait of Hormuz is open, and Pakistan is preparing to mediate what could become a permanent deal between the United States and Iran. Whether this becomes something real, we will find out very soon. This is the Prime Alert. Stay close. This story is far from over. What was improved open loops, planted deliberate questions. So what just happened? Weijing something changed, and we need to talk about what, that keep viewers watching to get the answer. Emotional triggers amplified the fear, relief, and disbelief already embedded in the original content, particularly around the nuclear threat subtext and the war crimes framing. Information fidelity. Every fact, quote, name, and claim is drawn directly from the original transcript. Nothing was invented or altered, just restructured and given voice.